The world is changing fast. Global pandemic, climate crisis, digital transformation, social inequality.
So far, have been evacuated from homes and campsites.
The future can seem more uncertain than ever before.
The sound of gunfire echoing.
It's time to think about what kind of future we want. Time to think beyond today's news cycle. Time for a more hopeful future. We cannot predict what is going to happen tomorrow, but we can prepare better for shocks and surprises.
Come and join us to explore the big challenges facing Europe and the world. We can choose the kind of future we want and the future we don't want.
Hear how Europe can tackle these challenges and what strategic choices we need to make for the long term.
It's time to think more clearly about the future.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this, the second day of the 2021 ESPAS Annual Conference. I'm Anthony Teasdale from the European Parliamentary Research Service, and it's my pleasure, indeed it's our pleasure in the ESPAS system to welcome you today, to host you here in the European Parliament Reading Room today, unfortunately without an audience in this complicated time in which we live. The ESPAS conference, and this is the 9th such annual event, traditionally takes place over 2 days. The first day is organised by the European Commission. I'd like to thank the Commission for their excellent work yesterday, and the second day by the European Parliament. But of course, ESPAS goes much wider than just these two European institutions. It encompasses the Council, the European External Action Service, the two EU advisory bodies, the Economic and Social Committee, the Committee of the Regions, the Court of Auditors, the European Investment Bank, and last but not least, the EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris. So many of the central EU institutions and bodies working together to think about the future and to draw upon the insights and the analysis and generally the intellectual community which exists worldwide thinking about the future, to seek to analyze medium and long-term global trends, and to draw out their implications for Europe and more widely, to develop and use foresight tools to improve the quality of policy making. Yesterday, the first day of the ESPAS conference was devoted mainly to talking about the European Commission's second annual Strategic Foresight Report, which was published 2 months ago. This is focused on developing the European Union's capacity and freedom to act, and it builds on last year's first Strategic Foresight Report on building the EU's resilience in the faces of this fast-changing and unpredictable world. We heard from Commission Vice President Šefčovič and from some of the ministers from the new forum which he has brought together of Ministers of the Future. The first day also looked at the themes of next year's conference and next year's Strategic Foresight Report, namely how best to twin the global, digital and green transitions, central challenges of our time. And today, in this European Parliament-led day, we are focusing on those global trends themselves and the emerging shape of the new world in which we, our children and our grandchildren will live over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And we're using as a basis for this reflection this document, which has just been published and is available on the conference website. It's called the ESPAS Global Trends Midterm Report, The Global Future, an Update. And what it does 2.5 years later is take stock of changes which have occurred since the Global Trends Report, which ESPAS produced in early 2019, Global Trends to 2030, Challenges and Choices for Europe. And the panel discussions that we're going to have today reflect many of the themes which are in this document. Europe and the world in 2040, what kind of new international order? democracy and authoritarianism, how to reverse the drift to Caesarism. How will artificial intelligence change humanity? And can we as human beings master our digital futures? How best to build back better? How can we and do we progress towards a greener and fairer recovery? We will also be taking a broader look at the risks, the opportunities, and the choices for Europe in tomorrow's world. Hearing from, as in all our panels, distinguished practitioners and commentators about what Europe needs to do to shape the future rather than to be shaped by circumstance or by the choices of others. We'll be looking in detail at the transatlantic dimension of all of this during the Biden presidency, asking what the emerging geopolitics of Europe, America, and the Indo-Pacific will look like, and discussing the future of foresight in and for Europe. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have a fascinating day ahead of us, with over 40 speakers from Europe, from Asia, from the Americas, and indeed around the globe. So let's think about the future together. Let's try to shape it for a better Europe and a better world. Thank you, and we look forward very much to the day that unfolds ahead. And thank you so much now for joining us, because we really appreciate the community which the ESPAS process has brought together and represents. Yesterday, I believe there were around 3,000 people who were watching at different points the proceedings that we put on. And so we hope that those 3,000 people, many others today, and many others who may watch the videos of this event in the future, will appreciate the fact that the European Union is thinking about the future and trying to improve the policy process which matters to us all. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to our first panel of a very busy day on Europe and the world in 2040. And the question we're asking is, what kind of a new international order will there be in 2 decades? I'm Shada Islam. I'm an independent EU commentator and analyst based here in Brussels, and it's my pleasure and privilege to facilitate this conversation. So, as I said, a busy day ahead of us, and now we have 75 minutes to discuss a very important issue. We know, and it's been said, the world is changing very, very fast, and the pandemic seems to have accelerated this process. It's a fascinating process. When we've adapted, we've shown our resilience, but we're also hoping that things will get back to a new normal. What kind of a world will there be in 2 decades? What kind of challenges will we face? In addition to climate change, dealing with pandemics, racism, inequalities, will there be a more humane international order? Will we be talking to each other as equals and with respect? Let me now turn to our panelists and introduce them to you. But before I do that, let me just say to you that we will be taking your questions and provide you with answers during this debate. You can put your questions in the Q&A box on your screens, but there is a very strong plea for me. Please keep them short and to the point. If they're long, I'm afraid I will not have the time to go to them and ask the panelists. So let me just say that very clearly. Short and simple and snappy. Thank you for that. Let me introduce our wonderful panelists. We have with us Yuichi Hosoya. He's Professor of International Politics at Keio University in Japan. Yuichi, welcome. Also joining us is Ian Lesser, Acting President of the German Marshall Fund. Ian, welcome as well. And Professor Dr. Daniela Schwarzer, Executive Director, Europe and Eurasia from the Open Society Foundations. Welcome as well, Daniela. And last but not least, Yuichi, Senior Research Fellow on China, Asia-Pacific Program at Chatham House. So I've explained the rules of engagement. Now let me start the panel discussion. I'm going to start with you, Daniela, if I may. In an article that you wrote earlier this year, and I'm going to quote, sort of, you said to project geopolitical power, the EU will need the transatlantic partnership in the medium to long term, you said. Doing more for its own security is a sign that Europe is increasing its contribution to the transatlantic project, not that Europe is turning away from the US. So I'm wondering, a question for you really is, can and how should the EU position itself in this increasingly contested and disputed world? What are the main challenges? And are we really serious about strategic autonomy? Is it a realistic objective? Daniela, the screen is yours for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much for those introductory questions. If I think ahead to the year 2040, as is requested for our panel, I have little reason to assume that the trends that are currently occupying our minds will turn around. And that is mostly the shift of power to Asia, both in economic, financial, military, and also demographic terms, a continuing rise of China, a real change of the international order simply because other world regions, which come from a very different normative base and a different understanding of international cooperation, they will reshape not only their own regional order, but also try to impact the international order more than they even do today. And in that situation, I think Europe has to care much more for itself. And that is in the quote which you kindly read out. Now, is Europe able to do that? I think we have all reasons to rethink how we can increase our ability to shape the global order and to defend our own interests. The first thing to do is obviously to consolidate internally, because as long as we have weaknesses and divisions internally that are so big as they are today, and they may be growing, we are vulnerable to external influence. And there's clearly an interest on the side of other actors to have a weak Europe rather than a strong Europe. And for the short and medium term, as my quote says, I do believe that Europe is not able to reach anything like strategic autonomy all by itself. And the question here is, so what do we then do? The US is a key partner. It goes without saying that this is the case in matters of defense and security. And in my view, it is also so in the area of tech, where we have to become far more competitive as Europeans. However, we need to pool our regulatory power with the US, despite some differences that do exist when we think about the regulation of big tech, of data. There are obvious differences, but we are still in one political camp, which is the liberal West. And so there's a huge interest to think through how in this increasingly changing world, we can defend the norms and principles that are actually constitutive to our own democracies. And then Europe has to look out for other partners as well. And that's why I think it is good that the EU has started to think about its own perspective and role in the Indo-Pacific. There are partners there with whom we should and can work. But all this will not happen, and I'll close with that for reasons of time, if the EU fails to gain strength internally, meaning transformation, digital, ecological transformation, but also a closer growing together of the single market, of the monetary union, and politically, which includes a very clear commitment of all member states to fundamental rules of the game in the EU, which is the rule of law and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniela, making some important points there, and I think a good start to our conversation, counting on the rise of China and the rise of the Indo-Pacific to continue, talking also about the need for Europe to consolidate and ease out some of its differences at the moment and the divisions that we have, but also saying that a weak Europe is not going to be a good partner for the world, and asking questions about strategic autonomy, but saying the transatlantic alliance is still very fundamental despite differences. Let me turn to you now, Yuichi, and also quote something you've written recently. You said that despite President Xi's iron fist approach to party control, China's foreign policy decision-making process remains fluid in nature, opaque in implementation, and erratic in coordination. Now, that's really quite interesting, because for us here in Europe, we see we've just seen the sixth plenum and how President Xi's powers have been, in fact, enhanced, if you like. His role has grown even more than before. And we sort of think that China is a homogeneous state where things can happen very rapidly. So my question to you also is that the correct impression that we have? And of course, when you look at China's assertive behavior across the world, are we going to see more of the same, China taking its global role and being very, very self-confident and assertive about it? What are China's global ambitions? Very simple to ask, really.
Well, thank you, Shada. And firstly, let me thank the ESPA teams again to have invited me to join this year's conference. I'm really delighted to be here. Now, secondly, Shada, on your question, is too huge? Let me try to answer within the next 3 minutes or so. I mean, even though you suggest it seems to be that the policy paper I wrote recently suggests to be an unorthodoxy approach, but this seems to be the conclusion made up by many sinologists and the China watchers that China is not necessarily a homogeneous country that run by one single interest and one single voice. I mean, there still remain very important competing interest groups, such as the state-owned enterprises and also provincial governments, would somehow really switching the different directions on its foreign policy. But whether this would really enhancing President Xi's power or not, surely his power has been concentrated ever since he came to power. But it does not necessarily mean that he has the capability and also the time of making every single important decisions on foreign affairs and also on domestic politics. And there have been much of the pushback, and that has already happened on the ground. I mean, I would just take a recent example that much has been discussed on China's so-called common prosperity initiative. And you mentioned on that the sixth plenum resolution and communique, the word of common prosperity has only been mentioned once. And that is already a very clear indication that there has been very strong pushback and resistance within the party to implement that initiative, because partially this will really jeopardize many of the commercial interests as well as the political interests of those provinces and the state-owned enterprises. So that's just to signal that there are pushbacks within the party that suggests Xi Jinping, it is still remain as the Communist Party ruling by consensus rather than ruling by one single person. Now, secondly, if we're talking about global trend, I mean, while we're talking about China seems to want to assume that a global leadership role, but actually what I've observed from China's latest economic 5-year plan, that seems to be that China begins to turn inward and also decouple itself from the rest of the world. And actually this decouple process is not because of COVID. It's actually already happened well before the COVID. I mean, for example, Made in China 2025, and also that pursued sense of self-reliance on its technology. So it is not, I would say, a decouple from the rest of the world in a wholesale manner, but instead, I would say, the golden age that China would embrace economic globalization, it is now over. And instead, the Chinese government and also the Chinese company have nowadays become very choosy in terms of what kind of foreign direct investment they are expected to receive within the country, and also very choosy on what kind of foreign investment they'd like to invest it abroad as well. So I think that trend is also very similar, like what will happen in Europe, begin to turn inward looking and building its own economic resilience and also political resilience, while waiting for perhaps the worst yet to come on the relationship between China and the United States. So I ended in here and look forward to hear questions and comments.
Yes, and there will be, I'm sure, many questions and comments, but Yuichi, challenging some of our assumptions about China. There is a pushback from the party. Xi's power is not complete, and as we think sometimes, pushback from the provinces, and China turning inwards and focusing very much on self-reliance. So really challenging some of our assumptions and opinions about what's happening within China and also its global aspirations. Ian, let me turn to you now. Ian Lessler. So, you know, we've been watching what's been happening in America very closely. And of course, President Joe Biden has said America is back. And of course, the Europeans, you know, we want to believe that because we really do cherish the transatlantic relationship, as has been said earlier. But let me read to you as well what you've said. You've written, really, on the website. And Ian, you said, the United States and Europe will also need a concerted approach to the long-term challenge of the rise of China. Yuichi has just spoken about that, and developments in Asia as well. And you said the challenge is multifaceted, encompassing trade, technology, ideology, and security. Now, we are a little puzzled about what does America is back really mean. Can we now expect a more predictable partner? Is there a likelihood that Donald Trump and his friends and allies could be back in power? What is going to happen in the transatlantic relationship in the coming years? Ian, the screen is yours.
Shada, thank you very much. It's very good to be with you. You know, obviously this is a key question, and sitting in Brussels, it's a question one hears almost every day. You know, my sense is that in many very meaningful ways, America is back. A more predictable America, a more predictable U.S. policy. I think President Biden is probably the most foreign policy-oriented president the United States has had since George H.W. Bush, actually. And of course, Europe at the end of the day really wants predictability from Washington. We're not always going to be on the same page. We've had all sorts of hiccups in recent months. You've seen these things. But on the whole, the style is completely different. And the style matters, actually. The style really matters. It matters with publics. It matters with political elites. And so I think in that sense, America is very much back. But you raised the question, it's a very real one, you know, how durable is this? And if you're looking out to 2040, as this exercise is, or even just to 2024, you know, we have to ask questions about that. A lot of the forces that were out there that fueled the Trump phenomenon are clearly still there. You know, the conclusion there is that Europe is fully vested in American politics. And yes, for the moment back, and I think hopefully stays back. Look, I mean, there's a steady accumulation of risk in this conference. We'll talk about many aspects of that. One of the key areas, some of it's in the European neighborhood, some of it's with Russia, a lot of it is with China. Certainly looking out over the next decades, a lot of it will be in the Indo-Pacific. Are we at the end of, you know, what could be described as a 100-year American pivot to Europe? Well, quite possibly, but how fast will that transition be? Hard to say. It could be slow, but also things could go very wrong in the Indo-Pacific that would greatly accelerate that trend and put much more pressure on European strategic autonomy, if you want to put it that way. I actually, just to conclude, happen to think that there is a strong basis in Washington now of support for a more a stronger, a more active Europe in the world in foreign and security policy terms. I think this administration is actually quite comfortable with that. And there are good reasons for that, because Europe is a key partner in managing these problems, and a more capable Europe is in America's interest. But there may be a window to make this happen in a way that is harmonious in a transatlantic sense. But let me end with that, Shada, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ian, as well. And yes, style does matter, as you've said, and hoping that this will be a durable comeback of the United States. Perhaps also asking the question, is the 100-year US pivot to Europe perhaps coming to an end, the focus turning to the Indo-Pacific? And interesting what you've said, Ian, that there is support for strategic autonomy efforts in the United States for the European Union. Thank you very much indeed for that as well. And there are questions that will be coming in, and I have some questions as well. Let me turn to you, Yuichi Hosoya, and talk to you a little bit about Japan's future foreign and security policy and relations with Europe. Now, you've written recently that you said, I think Japan needs its own strategic autonomy, probably more than ever before. Arguably, though, Japan has already been working on strategic autonomy since about 5 years, you say. Now, this is really interesting for us because, you know, we are, as you've heard now, you know, all our panelists have talked about it. We're in the midst of this discussion on strategic autonomy. It's a central feature of our political discourse. But in the Japanese context, Yuichi, what does it actually mean? Screen's yours for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm very glad to be with you and also with distinguished speakers in this session. The reason why I said that Japan needs its own strategic autonomy is that I think it is really important for Japan to combine two things. One thing is that the EU is promoting its own strategic autonomy. This is one thing. The other thing is the Japanese ruling party, current ruling party, LDP, repeatedly used this word. 2 years ago in a small working group, which was actually presided by Fumio Kishida, who is currently Japanese Prime Minister. In that small working group, there emerged two key concepts. One key concept is, of course, strategic autonomy. The other concept is that strategic indispensability. Japan must be indispensable in international economy and international politics. So by combining two things, on one hand, the EU is promoting and using the term strategic autonomy. On the other hand, Japanese ruling party is trying to crystallize the idea of strategic autonomy. That's why I think that it is really necessary for Japan to promote this idea. And next year, Japanese government is trying to revise previous Japanese national security strategy. The previous one, 10 years ago, I joined in drafting this Japan's first national security strategy. But next year, Japan is trying to have a new one. And in this sense, I think that there are two important backgrounds in this trend. The one thing is that, of course, the COVID-19. Because of the COVID-19, I think that the Japanese government is noticing that we are much more vulnerable than before. This is a thing. That's why Japan needs this strategic autonomy. On the other hand, I think that the US-China current rivalry and US-China decoupling actually is replacing Japan in a position that Japan needs to pursue its own national interests. That's why I think that it is really now, it is a right moment for Japan to promote this idea. And Japan has been already working on it. On one hand, Japan has promoted and created CPTPP without the United States. This is the Japanese decision to move forward. The other thing is FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific vision. This was made by Japanese initiative. So in the last 5 years, I think that regardless of the American unwillingness to participate, Japanese government has been promoting its own national interest with Japanese initiative. So this is a good example, I think, for Japan to present its own strategic autonomy.
Thank you very much indeed, Yuichi, making a strong point there about US-China rivalry changing Japan's outlook on the world. And you're absolutely right, very active now in the Indo-Pacific, and new strategic autonomy initiative coming out next year, you said, and the hope that Japan must be indispensable. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for the first, let's say, interventions. Now let me engage you and take you a little bit further on some of the points you've made, and perhaps start a conversation amongst yourselves as well. And do come back on some of the ideas that the other panelists have put forward. I'm going to start with you, Daniela, and you made a very important and I think very pertinent point about the need for internal consolidation and reinforcement within the EU, and you said divisions are growing and getting worse. And looking ahead, because that's what we're supposed to do, informed speculation, as we've been told. What do you think is going to be the scenario in terms of the EU internal cohesion? Will there be more countries asking to leave? Will there be more countries asking to come in? And how do we deal with this difference in values that is so much of a feature of the European Union today?
We are at a point in time where I think the EU really faces crucial decisions. One is whether it wants to be the union of values, which it is since its start, and whether it really wants to defend fundamental principles of rule of law and democracy, both internally, but also externally. And one doesn't go without the other. If we lose internal credibility, I think it will be very hard for the EU to continue to project those approaches to, good governance and so on in our neighborhood and further in the world. And what we see at the moment is that the United States are trying to team up with Europeans, but also with other partners in the world, with the Summit for Democracy, which is going to take place in December, and really want to create that network of countries that actually share that approach. And Europe really has to tackle its internal challenges. If it doesn't, it will lose that credibility. You asked whether countries will be willing to join in the future. I do believe that a few countries will continue to want to be part of the EU because the EU still promises wealth, it promises stability, it promises peace. However, those are not without conditions. And so the transformation process that countries who want to become members of the European Union need to go through is obviously to comply with the EU's rules. And this is becoming more and more difficult the longer we wait, because external actors with whom we are in systemic competition, like Russia or China, try to extend their influence. Now, just one last thought on the internal divisions. I think there are two reasons to be worried, but that doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. The one tendency is increasing political polarization, political volatility, the rise of far-right parties, which was somewhat stopped a few years ago, but I think the potential is still there that this resurges. We also see global networks of far-right, undemocratic parties that extend well into the European Union. And so there is something to worry about, that we will have increasingly players within the EU who want to actually weaken liberal democracy, and hence the whole model that the EU is being built on. The second and underlying development, which I find worrisome, is the lack of socio-economic cohesion. This is a problem between EU countries, but it is also a problem within EU countries. And two of the major transformation challenges that the EU is facing, both digitization, which will really change our economies, the way we work, the way we live, but then also the ecological transformation. Those are fundamental challenges for our societies. So what the EU needs to do is, while investing in modernization on both accounts, the question of how citizens actually see their future, we can see in Eurobarometer and other opinion polls that the skepticism with regards to their own individual future is growing. And this is a huge problem politically, because that makes them open to more populist tendencies, to unreal promises that some parties are willing to make. So in my view, the social and socio-economic side of the big transformations that we are facing as Europeans has to be included in the thoughts about how Europe can actually lead on those two issues. On tech and digital, we are clearly not leading. We are in a catch-up process. And that is something we have to be far more ambitious on. Because if we lose more of our tech competitiveness, already we are behind on some accounts, the EU will not be able to secure standard setting and our own principles in this increasingly competitive world.
Thank you, Daniela. I do have a follow-up question, but I'm going to first go to Yuichi, because Yuichi, Daniela has talked about countries wanting to weaken the European Union, and she's talked about creating a network of countries, democratic countries. Do you think that as we move into 2040, if you like, there's going to be a real clean break between the Western liberal democracies and the rest of the world, led by China? Do you think we're going for such a binary division in the world? One world, two systems, really?
Well, clearly we're heading that direction, but what is the end result for us? I mean, perhaps it's too soon to tell. I mean, what we were certainly facing, we're going to be facing a bifurcated world that based on different technology standard, that is based on different so-called normative values. And surely within China, I mean, that sense of the gene of authoritarianism has only been strengthened, if not weakening, in the past 10 years or so. So yes, we are going to be facing a division on normative value. But on the other hand, I think also because of the economic globalization that bring the world become more interdependent, and therefore because of the sheer size of the Chinese economy, and that for us, I mean, really for me, seems to be that decoupling, especially economic decoupling from China, seems to be a little bit too hard to do so, to achieve. So I think that's one thing. Now, secondly, what I've heard from Daniela, and she suggested, this sense of social economic cohesion. I think really for China, the challenge is actually lying on domestic front. Is that sense of there's those who feel they are really underperformed, and those who really the so-called underdog have not really benefited from China's last 40 years of economic reform. They also feel that sense of resentment. So precisely that is what the party is really afraid of, because of that sense of anger and resentment of those people, perhaps would even challenge the societal stability of China domestically. So what China is doing right now, I mean, if I could put an analogy in here, is actually fixing the roof while the shine is still shining. And that's precisely the China's domestic economic foreign policy, economic policies focusing on actually prepare perhaps for the worst yet to come on the US-China competition.
Thank you, Yuichi. So, Ian, usually they're talking about long-term planning going on in China, the sense of frustration and resentment, and a time for actually taking its place in the world. And, you know, we are talking about a bifurcated world. And I was just wondering, from your point of view, from the transatlantic point of view, is it really worthwhile to go down that route? Or is it better to find a way of coexistence, accommodation, living together despite our differences? What do you think is the trend now in Washington, D.C.? Because Joe Biden and Xi Jinping did have a recent conversation, which seems to have brought down tensions slightly. But at the same time, there is an arms race ongoing and nuclear race going on as well. So are we headed towards this kind of confrontational 2040, if you like?
It's a key question, obviously. Without question, on a bipartisan basis, there's been a tremendous hardening of attitudes and concerns about China over the last years in the United States. And frankly, when it comes to strategic priorities, the ones that the Trump administration talked about and the ones the Biden administration talks about are not that much different. China, number one, Russia, number two, as challengers. Everything else sort of a distant third in the security realm. I think in some sense, I don't know whether we would agree that we're in a Cold War, but, that's usually used in a very pejorative way. But of course, the Cold War also was an interesting example of how some systemic competitions with tremendous potential for catastrophe were managed over time. And part of that process was understanding what the other side wanted, even though you didn't agree, and understanding what was stabilizing and what was destabilizing. That took decades in the case of the Soviet Union with the West. We've just embarked on that if we're in that kind of a systemic competition with China. China's growing strategic capacity for power projection and other things is going to be a concern, but do we really understand together what's stabilizing and what's destabilizing, in an area where brinkmanship is not impossible in the South China Sea, over Taiwan and other places? I think you give an example, and there are probably some tentative signs that we are coming to the realization that even on difficult things like nuclear strategy, we need to have a conversation with China. So I think that's where we are. I think it's a very serious competition, but as it gets more serious, there is also pressure on finding ways to manage it in ways that that doesn't get out of control.
Managing competition perhaps will be the challenge as we go forward. Yuichi, let me just ask you, one thing that has happened during the last 20 months or so, actually more than that, is that Japan has become a very important partner for the European Union. There have been summits, there's a partnership, trade agreements, science and cooperation, etc. How is Japan sitting there in the Indo-Pacific focusing on the European Union as a partner? What do you see in the EU that sort of makes you Japan want to become closer to the European Union? Is it the like-mindedness? Is it the democracy, the norms? What brings us together, do you think?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, the United States is Japan's only ally. So that's why the United States remains in the future Japan's most important partner, in particular in international security field. But on the other hand, I think that the EU will become much more important for Japanese foreign policy because Japan shares so many things with the European Union, such as the rule of law, multilateralism, and of course, peace and prosperity in the region, and particularly relying on non-military means to settle international disputes. This is another important reason why I think that the European Union will become furthermore important Japanese strategic partner. So in this way, I think that United States and Japan, United States and Japan and the European Union should coordinate their differences more to be more influential in the region, I mean, in the Pacific region. And I think in this way, Japan can play important role because Japan has EU-Japan EPA, SPA, and of course, Japan has an alliance relationship with the United States. So in this way, I think that Japan can promote furthermore coordination of differences and cooperation among the three, I mean, the Japan, European Union, and the United States. And in addition to this, Japan joins in CPTPP, and Japan joins in the Quad. And in this way, I think that Japan furthermore coordinate differences in this region with other democracies. And besides, Japan joins in RCEP as well, RCEP with China and South Korea. So this, I think, brings the situation in which Japan can become a really influential player by focusing on both strategic autonomy and strategic indispensability, as I mentioned before.
Thank you very much, Yuichi, as well. So really a growing kind of, I think, mutual attraction between Japan and the European Union. Now, if I could just say, we have talked about democracy and authoritarianism and the big divide, but can I ask Daniela and Ian, how confident are we when we talk about democracies today? Because if you look at the Freedom House indexes and, democracy is in decline, it's being eroded, and there are very few countries that you can actually stand up and say, yes, we're like-minded. So tell me a little bit, Daniela, because inside the European Union, we've talked about what's happening in certain parts of Europe, not just in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in parts of Western Europe. So how confident are we that the summit of democracies will really bring together countries that will stand up and be proud of being democratic and are not in a downward spiral?
Well, I think, first of all, the analysis is right and has to be really taken very seriously, that we see a decline of democracy or of elements of democracy like rule of law, free media, civic space in many countries, including within the European Union. In my view, that's really the battle, one of the battles of our future, whether we want to give in to those trends or whether we stand up and say, no, we do believe that despite all, all complications, democracy and liberal democracy is still the model we want to have and we want to live in. And what we can see very clearly is that even within those countries which are problematic also from the EU's perspective, if you look at public opinion, there's no majority actually to leave the EU, to leave this model of liberal democracies that have decided to pool sovereignty because integration promises a better provision of wealth, of peace, of stability. So I think this is really something, we need to look at the data, yes, but this should be an encouragement to be even more self-critical on what works and what doesn't work in our democracies, and then to think through new ways of actually leveraging the joint power of democracies. So the Summit for Democracy, which will take place in December, I think will not change the world, but it will be a very clear political signal. It should be used by both the EU and the US to reflect upon the question, how can we work together to help each other deal with our own internal weaknesses? And that is maybe, even Ian can say much more on that, but from a European perspective, the situation in the United States is, of course, very worrisome. Obviously, we have a uniquely lucky situation at the moment with Joe Biden in the White House, and we have, at least until the midterms, then probably, and unfortunately, a new situation in domestic politics in the US if the Democrats lose their majority. But still, we have the term of Joe Biden to really think through how we can align better, how we can strengthen each other, and how we can have a stronger impact in the changing international system. But we have to be very honest. The weaknesses and fragilities of our democracies are tangible. But from my perspective, this is not a reason to give in, but really to think harder. What do we need to do? And this brings me back to what I said earlier on the societal challenges and socioeconomic challenges that we need to tackle within the EU. but also that the US will have to tackle.
So let me go to Ian before I turn to Yuichi and Yuichi as well. So Ian, yes, I mean, there are some very, very similar challenges. Was one of the things that the United States is grappling with, and so are we here in Europe, really is racism, inequalities, the demands for social justice. And democracies have to deliver on those challenges, on those requests and demands. And do you think that the Summit of Democracy will be able to tackle some of these very basic challenges and inequalities that exist in our Western democracies before we are ready to deal with the competition, if you like?
Well, I mean, it's an excellent question. And, you know, let me also say I agree with virtually every word that Daniela said, including her comments about the United States. I think that's exactly right. And I think it goes back to the point that I think we've all made in various ways, which is that we're all vested in the political outcomes on the other side of the Atlantic. You know, obviously Europe and the United States, and we'll see in the midterms and the next presidential election, but also, you know, the United States and Europe. And it does, you know, on questions of migration and tolerance and all of these other things in Europe, it wouldn't take too many elections going the wrong way for American interests to be very seriously harmed in Europe. Most of those forces that are nationalistic, authoritarian, intolerant are also not Atlanticist. And so, you know, this is a reason for concern. And the point about self-reflection is exactly right. I mean, Shada, to your question more directly, I mean, the points you mentioned really are at the top of the agenda in the United States. But I also think they're closely bound up with something that Daniela mentioned, which is, you know, questions of equity in society, diversity in society, tolerance in society, but also equity in a broader sense. And the COVID experience and the economic crisis has really tested that in new ways. The Summit for Democracy, I mean, this is obviously not going to solve problems, but it tells you something about the importance of this space to the Biden administration. And the plan, as I understand, is the follow-on, if it's successful, is to be in Europe. So it's a transatlantic sort of project as well. We'll see how it goes, but you know, the basic point is not to be complacent about any of this. And if that exercise helps us not to be complacent, I think it's a good thing.
Thank you, Ian. Yuichi, when you hear Daniela and Ian talk about this competition, building up the democracies and the working together against competition from China. So China is on everyone's mind. And when you look at China today, and you've said it's turning inwards, but it does have a very assertive, self-confident, renewed self-confident approach to its neighborhood. I'm thinking about the Indo-Pacific, the South China Sea, but I'm also talking about globally through the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, there is great heightened concern here in Europe about China's relationship with Taiwan. And the question we worry about really, is there going to be, is China going to invade Taiwan? Is that something that you think President Xi Jinping will be planning, doing? Is there pressure from the domestic public opinion for such an action, do you think, Yuichi?
Well, Shada, this is a really million-dollar question here. I try my best to answer. Now, what we will expect is we're going to be expecting a longer-term standoff between China and the United States on Taiwan Strait. So I would suggest the military standoff with a heightened tension, but not necessarily a full-blown military escalation, precisely because the Chinese domestic economy is now entering the phase of economic transition. So many parts of China just simply can't afford while having economic deleveraging, economic restructuring at the same time, while having an external military confrontation across Taiwan Strait. So that does not fit into the economic rationality. And secondly, because precisely for the economic management, that it really depends on determining the legitimacy and the survival of the party. And therefore, it's quite hard for presidency to make up their mind by begin to start with a full-blown military escalation towards Taiwan, firstly. But secondly, they're also very equally important that, yes, the public opinion, it is strong. The public opinion seems like also hijacked how the diplomats behave, and also the public opinion seems to require the leadership to respond to a certain way. But however, just imagine China's society in the last 70 years hadn't really had any sort of like a military standoff or military escalation at all. I mean, in general, within society, people much prefer to have a pacifist the way of organizing society rather than really having a military conflict escalation. It is not in the interest of the Chinese population either. So I wouldn't say that even if the public opinion seems to be very strong, but while we're talking about economic calculation here, that perhaps the mistakes would be so grave if we suddenly start to have some sort of military escalation towards Taiwan.
Thank you for that, Yuichi. So really, in a sense, economic interests trump politics and security, sovereignty issues. But let me just ask you another question as well. You know, we're talking about the Summit of Democracies, right? In I think 7th and 8th of December in the US. Is China going to have a summit of its authoritarian friends, if you like? Is that going to be the result of what we're going to see? Summit of Democracies on one side and another summit on the other side, with perhaps, you know, Russia, China, and others joining. Is that what we're headed for?
Well, not necessarily. I don't think it will be something so-called summit of authoritarian regime or whatsoever. But I think what we might have is we might have the summit between China and the global south, as we have already experienced, like, for example, China-Africa Cooperation Forum or China and the Shanghai Five. So you might have that China prefer to establish itself being the leader of the so-called global south and provide alternative in terms of global governance, in terms of foreign direct assistance and so on and so forth. So it's not necessarily that China using its normative values that really try to attract the so-called global south and developing countries, but instead, I think it will be based on state capitalism behavior, that by utilizing its enormous financial resources, that extending its political influence. So the old trick of economic statecraft still going to be closely practiced by Beijing. But having said that, there's a slight element in here of, I would suggesting that downgrade the Belt and Road Initiative. Again, just judging from the 6th plenum communique, that the word of Belt and Road has been dropped quietly. So it shows that Beijing realized the BRI in the past 8 years, it seems to be a liability rather than an asset for China's global geostrategic objective.
So interesting. So just as the EU is coming out with its global gateway connectivity project, China seems to be less interested in promoting the Belt and Road Initiative. Thank you for that insight as well. Yuichi, let me just talk to you about Japan a tiny little bit as well. And Japan in the Indo-Pacific is a major power. There's a question that's come in as well, is how does Japan see its relations with China? Is there a long-term strategic concern with competitive coexistence? Is that possible, or a rival? Is it a zero-sum game?
Well, thank you very much. Japan has had more than 1,000 years history of having a good relationship or having a difficult relationship with China. So naturally, Japanese people know a lot about how to deal with China's problem. And I think that in coming year or coming decades, China question will be our biggest problem. In the 19th century and 20th century, I think the German question was one of the biggest question and problem in the international politics. But in the 21st century, China question will be the biggest one. And the China question has many different aspects. One aspect is, well, we have to deal with exceedingly powerful China. But at the same time, we will have to deal with exceedingly vulnerable China at the same time. And the combination of the two, on one hand, China is exceedingly powerful. On the other hand, China will be perhaps exceedingly vulnerable in some sense. The combination of the two will provide us quite unforeseeable future. And I think that Japan's vision for regional order is basically quite inclusive. Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy has several dimensions, but on one hand, it focusing on the importance of inclusiveness without excluding totally China from that regional vision. But at the same time, of course, it is also important to stick to some of the important points, such as the rule of the law. as long as China is trying to stick to the rule of law, I think that China can play an undoubtedly leading role in it. So we have to help China to be a benevolent, constructive player in the region. And this is what Japan has been trying to do, like in the 1990s. Japan was the leading power to try to bring China into the WTO. And also Japan has been one of the biggest provider of foreign direct investment in China. So in this way, I think Japan still has a role to play in the region.
Thank you very much, Yuichi. That was a question that came in from Mehmet Kenachi. It is a very difficult balancing act, isn't it? So you talk about inclusiveness, and of course that means bringing China into the fold. But I have to say also at the same time competing, which is what the EU is trying to do as well. So it is a balancing act. It's very fragile. And how do you actually manage this competition and strategic rivalry at the same time as partnership? And we've seen that, how difficult it can be. Let me turn now to the big issues of multilateralism. And we know that we are faced with a very fragilized and weakened multilateral system. Part of it is, of course, because under Donald Trump, the United States was not such a keen participant in the multilateral system. Part of it is also because of China emerging more self-confident, more assertive, changing some of the rules, not playing by the rules, according to some critics. So let me turn to you, Daniela, as well. The EU always says that multilateralism is part of its DNA. It's what we do at home in Europe, and that's what we believe in outside as well. Where do you think the most effective participation or leadership the European Union can show when it comes to the multilateral system? Is it on climate? Is it on ocean governance? Is it on pandemics? Is it on trade? Where should we put our efforts into? What should it be? What should be our priority?
The EU is usually strongest in those areas where it is internally most integrated. And from the list you gave, my first point would clearly be on trade, because this is an EU competence, and the EU has a lot of economic power to bring to the negotiation table. And although we know that the global trade, the World Trade Organization, has been challenged over the past years, I think this is really where Europe can bring its best power to the table, because it is a very attractive player. And so the leverage is comparatively strong. Then there are other areas where I think, the case for multilateral cooperation is simply so enormously strong, and that is climate, and that is also the management of global health crisis. For the latter, I wish to emphasize that it is really not about only protecting Europeans through a global system, but it is also looking at what Europe, together with the US, China, and other major players, can do for the global South. Because in terms of pandemic prevention, I think that it is obvious now with the way COVID-19 has developed that if we do not manage to bring down infection rates in all areas of the world, basically, we will not be able to handle this pandemic. So this is something we should do out of self-interest, but also because of necessary solidarity with those countries that cannot provide for their citizens vaccines and testing in the way they would need to. So I think those would be my three top priorities. We haven't discussed security much, but I think this is also something, as we see a change in the global security order, a change in the nature of conflicts, security really also moves to the forefront. And the better Europe and the US, together with other partners, manages to cooperate on that topic, I think the safer we will feel in Europe, because currently we are facing a rapidly changing security environment, which will be even more accelerated with the spread of technologies. And until the year 2040, unless we reach a new global security order, I think we will not, or the EU will not have delivered, and the governments will not have delivered on the promise to provide security for their citizens.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you for bringing in the topic of security. And of course, I referred to the arms race as well. And when we think about arms race and security issues, we obviously think of AUKUS. the Australian-UK-US military alliance that was announced just as the EU was actually announcing its Indo-Pacific strategy. So let me turn to you, Ian, first to ask you about this focus that Daniela has said is very important in having a new global security order. We've talked about managing our differences and all that, but that does require that we actually sit down and have some kind of a treaty, something to stop the arms race, a damaging arms race, etc. So do you think Joe Biden is going to be focusing on getting this kind of international coalition or arrangement, arms treaty in the coming months?
Well, I wouldn't be very optimistic about the prospects for something global on this front. That's just very hard to do. There are structures that have existed for many decades, and they've only gone so far on this, the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, and so on, other things. It's very difficult, and he would face a very difficult road if it took the form of a treaty with the US Senate. Even in administrations that were very inclined to do that on nuclear testing and other issues have found it very, very difficult. So there's a reason domestically why that's a little tricky, and there are reasons internationally why it's difficult. But I do think there are places, sort of nodes of competition around the world that are becoming more dangerous, more nuclearized. And there, I think there can be specific understandings about what to do. Arms limitation is one course, of course, and that could involve bringing China, for example, into existing frameworks like New START and things of that kind that are designed to limit the number of warheads and so forth. But beyond that, I think what's terribly important is simply, as I said before, to have an understanding about strategic vocabulary, to understand each other when it comes to what we think is stabilizing and what is destabilizing. And there are big open questions about that. Are strategic defenses stabilizing or destabilizing? We had these kinds of discussions with the Soviet Union. We've continued to have them more or less successfully with Russia. We will have to have them with China. And there are spaces, for example, on the subcontinent where this hasn't even started really. So I think, this is something that I'm sure the administration would be very keen to do. It will be very difficult to do. And when it comes to things like AUKUS, I mean, we'll have to see how that plays out. But my own sense is that from the point of view of Australian decision-making, this was less about buying a system than it was about buying an insurance policy in terms of the strategic relationship with the United States. And I'm sure we're going to see more of that kind of thing in the future. It will not be easy to manage diplomatically.
So more of these issue-based alliances rather than global treaty. And I think Xi Jinping and Joe Biden did talk about a possible arms limitation arrangement between the two. It's a long process, of course, ahead of us. Let me turn to you, Yuichi, from the Chinese point of view. Multilateralism, China's been, as I said, accused of actually not abiding by certain rules in the World Trade Organization. At COP26 as well, India came in first and talked about, not phasing out coal, but phasing down coal, and then China backed it, making it much more of a powerful challenge to COP26. So where would China put the emphasis when it talks about multilateralism and commitment to multilateralism, as President Xi Jinping has said repeatedly, actually?
Well, I think the two things that China is interested in here, firstly, that any sort of multilateral deals or multilateral mechanism has to be performed under UN-led system, firstly, and also under the framework of G20. So that's one thing. Now, secondly, is also China is very keen to establish itself as being the leader of the so-called global south, because one of the key arguments that China has been keep pushing recent years with the UN is that since 1945, the world has changed a lot, and therefore the rule of the 1945 is no longer fitting for the purpose of the 21st century, which to some extent China has the point. And therefore what China is really inclined to do is firstly to increasing its agenda setting role within the United Nations, but also try to expanding its voice of projecting the so-called discursive power, the ability to be able to set up the international discussion agenda from the very beginning of the discussion. So that is the two things that China is very keen to establish on. But really judging by the record how successful it has been so far, I think the part of the reason is, firstly, China has returned some sort of partial success. But secondly, I think there's also a lack of alternative because while we're talking about BRI, while we're talking about the global gateway and so on and so forth, it seems to be that China already have a certain initiatives being in place through the multilateralism framework for many, many years. And then EU and United States, and really nowadays playing catching up process in here. So I wouldn't necessarily say that is whose fault, but essentially what China's trying to do in here is trying to expanding its voice and try to add in additional chairs on the table. It's not exactly challenging the existing multilateralism by completely overthrowing the system, but instead is try to change the ways that perhaps is not really in China's interest. So I think that's what China is really after for.
Thank you very much. And from the Japanese point of view, what would the focus be when we talk about multilateralism? Where would you put the emphasis? I know that connectivity has been a big issue also for Japan, and Japan has a connectivity partnership with the EU, but also a trade and growth corridor, Asia-Africa trade and growth corridor as well. So where is Japan putting its energies when it talks about multilateralism?
Well, very much indeed. I feel that international environment becomes much more confrontational, much more competitive, and also much more contradictory. Contradictory in the sense that while the United States has been promoting and advancing a kind of a decoupling with China, Japan and the EU are promoting the idea of connectivity. And I think that Japan should join, in some sense, this kind of a decoupling process. But I think Japan's role and the EU role are connecting the world, each region. And in that role, I think both Japan and EU can play an important role, while there are some difficulties in our relationship with China. But I think world much more becoming much more divisive. In this divisive world, I think that the globalization cannot stop. That's why I think that the Japan and EU should promote the strategy of connectivity based upon our understanding that the globalization cannot stop.
Thank you very much. Now, there's a question coming in from Ivar Hendler, and I think I'd like to put it to actually whoever wants to take it up, and I'm sure Daniela would like to. It's about, do you think that the EU can become the quote-unquote global normative power and create global democratic standards for tech, data, and governance? Daniela.
I think that is a very long shot because we are seeing that in particular in the area of tech, we are not leading on many of the key future technologies. And I do believe that competitiveness and a really solid economic base in a certain sector where you want to be a regulatory power is really a necessity. That is why I argued earlier on that on key technologies, we need to seek partnerships. From the European perspective, the worst scenario is really that we end up with 3 tech spheres in the world. And that is possible still. The better scenario is that we align with other powers which share Western liberal approaches to the management of technology, the use of technology, for instance, by governments, the protection of data, everything that goes with many of the key regulatory questions that really influence the way individual rights are protected and the way democracy functions. So I think it is more likely than, at least for some time, we will see 2 spheres emerging. But in my view, it is important that Europe is at the core of a larger sphere of countries that cooperate on those norms and standards in view of protecting fundamental principles that underlie our Western liberal model.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Daniela. So now we're coming towards the end of our fascinating conversation. And I thought I'd ask all 4 of you, and I'm going to start first with Japan, and just to give us a taste of your major takeaway from this conversation when you decide what you predict, speculate on what 2040 will look like. From the Japanese point of view, from your point of view, Professor, how do you see, what's your one major takeaway from this conversation?
Well, thank you very much indeed. I personally feel that we are seeing much more changes than continuity in the last several years, of course, including COVID-19. So the world is becoming much more unpredictable. In this unpredictable world, we need more conversation, we need more dialogue. By exchanging our views, I think that we can share more things in the current unpredictable world. I think this is an important thing that I learned in this conversation. And so that's why I think really we need this kind of conversation, even with online format. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So a world is unpredictable, but that makes it even more necessary that we talk to each other. Yuichi, from your point of view.
Thank you, Shada. Well, I use one of my favorite sentences from the Italian novel that everything has to change, and therefore, in order to keep everything the same, I mean, the case would apply to China. The case would apply for Sino-US relations. That China and United States will have to talk to each other, in order to make sure that the peaceful coexistence could possibly continue. And also China perhaps will have to change its behavior diplomatically, and therefore to furthering extended its economic ties with its global trading partners. Because at the end of the day, for me, there seems to be a permanent contradiction between, on the one hand, China's economic goal and vis-a-vis on the current China's diplomatic behavior. So that here's to say, everything has to change in order to keep everything as the same.
Thank you very much indeed. Ian.
I mean, that's a wonderful analogy, and I know it too, and I would have used it. It's a wonderful one to use. I'm not going to use it, but I agree. Look, I take away, I think we've all said in different ways that, we all feel rather exposed and insecure in different ways. And clearly this is true at the level of geopolitics. The big picture is becoming more competitive, but also societies, are becoming insecure in various ways on issues of equity, on issues of health, on issues of security inside countries, many, many different fronts. And many of these points are actually points of convergence potentially. And so, I think we didn't talk about it too much, but as we are also in a space where, the state is in many ways back everywhere, it makes all of these questions of sovereignty and multilateralism much tougher. It's a much more complicated scene, but there also does leave us with many points of potential convergence and cooperation, transatlantic, but also globally. And that's well worth talking about.
There's a question there, Ian, that I think I should put to you now, and I think it's very relevant to what you've just said about points of convergence. It's from Eamon Noonan, and he says, is there a responsibility on the US and allies to try and allies to themselves to avoid escalating tensions over Taiwan?
Well, of course there is. I mean, we have we have a value stake in what's going on across the straits. We have a strategic stake, but we also have a very strong stake in making sure that something does not go wrong. And things can very easily go wrong. And that's one question that's been put, but you could have put different contingencies in different geographic settings into that frame. We do have a stake in stability, and as China becomes more capable, as the competition becomes more serious, it seems to me that part of it, the stability part of it, also becomes part of our responsibility.
Thank you very much. Daniela, your takeaway?
I'd like to pick up the points made on uncertainty and volatility and crisis management that I think some way or another all previous speakers mentioned. And I would say that it's not only about exchanging more, as Yuichi has said, or finding common points of convergence. I think that those are super important, but we also have to question our very own governance models. Because what we see with the nature of crisis, the evolving nature of conflicts, we need a much broader approach to crisis management. And while, yes, the state is back and governments take an increasing role, I think in order to be able to deliver, both domestically but also in international cooperation, the coordination with other actors like civil society in some areas like climate transition and management of climate crisis, definitely the private sector have to be brought in a very forward-looking way. And so we have to work on the actually modes of governance, both domestically and internationally.
Thank you very much indeed, Daniela. So we're coming to the end of this conversation. I have to say, for me, the takeaway is really, it's enormous, really, because we have talked about change and, how it's volatile, unpredictable happenings. I mean, the pandemic, many say that we should have been prepared, but let's be very frank, we were not prepared, but we adapted and we've shown a certain degree of accommodation and resilience, and it's something that we will actually have to live with. We've talked a lot about the rise of China and the rise of the Asians. We've talked about the Indo-Pacific, but as someone who follows these global developments very closely, it's all very well to focus on China and India. Of course, we haven't talked much about India, but of course, India is a very important part of the Indo-Pacific as well. But the Indo-Pacific is diverse. It's not just about China, and I think Yuichi will agree with me, and so will our Japanese friend. It's also about the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which is very, very central to peace, stability, and security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. And there's also, of course, South Asia. We haven't much talked about South Asia. It's not just India, but there are about 2 billion people in South Asia, growing middle class, and I think the Indo-Pacific is very much part of that as well, and I think the Americans and the Europeans are realizing. So diversifying, I think, is going to be a trend as well. And I think there I do believe that we've talked about a divided world, a world split in two, a one world, two systems. But I often think that in today's world, and we've seen it with what we call subnational alliances, it's a mix and match world. Countries have agency. Countries and their leaders and their people decide very much who they want to go with, who they want to cooperate with or compete with, on what sector. So as many of our panelists have said, though there will be competition, there will be areas of convergence. And even amid, I hope, amid the competition, we can avoid confrontation, because in the end, it's about the humanity that matters. We've talked about, and I really appreciated the comments that have come on democratic backsliding as well. I think this is very important, and I'm very, very aware of the fact that in the European Union, this is one of the biggest challenges we're facing when it comes to erosion of some of our basic rules of democracy, media, judges, society, LGBTQI rights, women's rights. These are under threat in many parts of the world, but we also have racism still, and it is not just a woke question that the European Union is importing, or some in the European Union are importing from the United States. It's also very endemic within the EU, and it has global implications as well. We've talked about, as I said, a mix and match world. We've talked about multilateralism as well, and I think this is one way. We often say globalization has come to an end, and the pandemic has led to reshoring and onshoring of supply chains, and we talked about how people are decoupling from each other. China says it's going to look inwards. The United States is looking inwards as well with some of its infrastructure projects, and very needed and very important that it does so. The European Union, as always, has an array of internal questions to deal with, and the conference on the future of Europe, of course, is going on as well. But these are also some of the things that we are tackling and that are going to be very important when we stand, as Daniela has said, when we stand on the global stage and we tell our neighbors and we tell the rest of the world that these are the rules that you have to play by. It's very, very important that we do so as well. And multilateralism, of course, also means includes also keeping the world trade system alive. It has served us well. It has served us very well during the pandemic. There was not protectionism, even though many feared that this would happen. So we really had a fascinating conversation. We've heard a very interesting national points of view, but also I think everyone coming together to say, look, even amid all this confrontation, this rivalry, strategic and rest, we can still talk to each other. And that's exactly what we've done during this conversation. So I'd like to thank our panelists, really all four of you, for joining us and for being so able and so ably defining what your priorities and your concerns are. So thank you very much indeed also to the participants who joined us, who have sent us questions, and I think we've had an absolutely fascinating conversation. So now I'm going to retire and say thank you very much indeed for joining us. Stay safe and take care. And the next session that will start at 10:45 is on democracy and authoritarianism. So nicely segueing into the next topic, how to reverse the drift to Caesarism. And the moderator is Guy Milton from the Council Secretariat. So once again, thank you to the panelists, and thank you for all of you for joining online. Please stay tuned and take care. Bye-bye.